describe to me what you saw when you looked into his bedroom.
It looked like he was asleep in his bed, and I said, hey, get up. He didn't move, and then when I walked over the bed, I saw it looked like a brain or something coming out here.
3 large caliber gunshot wounds to the head are really ugly.
The vast majority of homicides in New Hampshire aren't whodunit. This was a whodunit.
So why did you have to shoot him then?
I didn't shoot him.
Information to solve cases comes from people telling you things.
I don't know nothing.
And if people do not want to talk to you, then you can't solve anything.
Just be truthful. All right?
It's easy to mess with someone's head when it's filled with fear. How much can I make you believe that you're going to be tortured for the rest of your days on this planet unless you start telling me the truth?
Did you shoot that man?
Pressure works.
My name's Gary Bartis, born and raised right here in Manchester, New Hampshire. I grew up in a housing project, so there were 2 choices, be a criminal or be a cop. And I just wanted to be a police officer.
And the last service rank one is for Gary Bartis.
And I was a police officer in the state for 44 years. I was a detective sergeant with the Auburn Police Department.
Auburn is a lot of open fields, beautiful, like suburban homes. You think when you're going somewhere like Auburn that you're in a safe, family-oriented, pretty quiet location.
People would always ask me, well, what do you do as a cop in Auburn? I said, I do the same thing as a New York City officer does, just a lot less of it. And that morning, I was actually in the station. We received a 911 call that there was a dead body.
There are always murders on Christmas. I always had a homicide, either Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. Everybody's home, everybody's drunk, and somebody is unhappy with yet another tie.
When I first got to the scene, I was very familiar with the property. It's like an old cottage going back to like the 40s. It's on a big piece of land.
The officers who first discovered the body have confirmed, in fact, that the victim is the homeowner, 50-year-old George Jodwin.
George Jodwin was well known in the area. Never had any real serious calls to service at that residence.
Bartis goes as directed by the patrol officers on the scene to the upstairs master bedroom.
First thing we see is George is in bed. For lack of a better terminology, it looked like his brain was on the pillow.
They see a person with gaping gunshot wounds to the head. Large caliber gunshot wounds to the head are really ugly. It's like dropping a grenade in somebody's ear canal. It's incredible the amount of damage it does.
There was blood splattered on the headboard of the bed and as well as the wall.
They look more closely at the gunshot wounds, 2 in the head and 1 in the neck.
There were no shell casings in the bedroom, which indicated to us that it was a revolver.
George was tucked under the covers. He didn't change into any pajamas or anything like that. There was no signs of any struggle.
He's in a relaxed position, probably passed out from alcohol. You can always smell alcohol in someone's breath if you're close to them, but you can also smell it in their blood. He appeared to just be asleep when he is executed by somebody with a large caliber handgun, and probably never felt it. Bartis can't think of a single reason why someone would want to fill his head with bullets, yet here he is.
What I knew about George is that he had a personality, a big personality. He owned a pawn shop on the west side of Manchester.
He was active in the community. He did run for the city office. He had his pilot's license. He played the piano. He owned a yacht, and he would go sailing to different countries.
He's a confirmed bachelor. He is very successful in business. He paints a picture of a very interesting man, a Renaissance man, perhaps.
The Jodwin family was very well known. You just don't expect a family like that to be victimized.
You don't really realize that these things could happen in your town until they do. And it is a shock and a wake-up call that these things can happen to anybody anywhere.
Nothing in the room was really disruptive except for some dresser drawers that were open. And so I thought that was kind of like odd. What would be the reason for that?
There's no real fast, crazy tossing that happens in burglaries. Is this just a mess? Or was someone looking for something in George's dresser?
The house didn't have any signs of forced entry. As a matter of fact, the door going into the kitchen was wide open, unlocked. There was no pry marks, nothing indicating a burglary. To me, as an investigator, that indicates that the person that committed the crime knew him. The kitchen, there's a pile of dishes in the sink. There's some empty alcohol bottles.
It's the holidays. Perhaps a party was underway on the 26th, and this is the result, the aftermath of a party. The obvious question is, who is at this party? It would be likely to consider that one of them is responsible for this death. They do an area canvass. Most of the neighbors report that there were multiple gunshots in the afternoon, but explain that that's not unusual. Mr. Jodouin often does target practice on his own property. The only thing that bothered them was they heard 3 distinctive gunshots late at night, which is something that's never happened before.
The neighbor that lives directly across the street, he had heard the gunshots, looked at his digital clock that was on his bedstand and it said 10:48. So we knew the time frame of the actual murder.
When something bad happens, something this big, things spread like wildfire. All of a sudden, everybody knows what's going on.
George Jodouin's brother arrives, Peter Jodouin, and wants to do everything he can to aid the police. It's fortunate that Peter arrived when he did because he was present at the party the house appears to have had the night of the victim's death.
Peter was telling us that particular day, on the 26th, he had found George's .44 Magnum in a piano that George had given him, and he brought it back knowing it was George's weapon.
They asked Peter who was in attendance at this affair, and he says,
one of George's friends, Ricky Karen, was there.
Ricky Karen had used George's land to go hunting for birds, and then Arthur Collins had showed up.
Arthur Collins was kind of a handyman, junk man, do anything for you for a buck kind of guy. Was there towing a vehicle off the property.
So there were 3 people with totally different reasons for being there. So they decided to take the gun Peter brought in target practice.
They were having a few drinks and they were target practicing with a .44 Magnum.
It's a .44 Magnum revolver, so no ejected casings. .44 Magnum is one of the largest calibers available in a handgun, so it would produce massive gunshot wounds, the same type that George Jodouin suffered from. So Bartis reasonably concludes that that's the murder weapon, and whoever used it took it with him.
We were told that Arthur left earlier.
And then eventually Peter had to leave because his daughter had a high school basketball game.
So when he left, the only people present were George Jodouin, the victim, and Ricky Karen. They asked Peter, well, Ricky, does he get along well with George? Well, yes and no.
They would have some squabbles about foolish things sometimes, but that's just the way their relationship was.
So now we have 2 guys in a room separated by a .44 Magnum and a bunch of alcohol, and they have a history of arguments. So Ricky Karen is obviously the momentary focus.
Just as Peter was telling us that Ricky was one of the last ones to see George alive, Ricky arrived at the scene.
How convenient, Mr. Karen.
He was nervous, he was upset, questioning what was going on. Why is he there? It was just, to me, very suspicious.
At that moment, Bartis looks at Ricky Caron's pants, and they're covered in dark red specks.
The assumption was they were bloodstains.
There is a cloud of blood that emanates from a gunshot wound. The blood moves toward the killer. The killer is going to have high-velocity blood spatter on his clothing. It seems that Mr. Caron has a little explaining to do. Ricky Caron has shown up at the scene with what looks like high-velocity blood spatter on his pants. Caron says, I don't know what you think that is, but what it is ink. I'm a screen printer. You never take a suspect at his word, but you do take what you think might be evidence from his person, and in this case, it's his pants.
We brought him down to the police station, give him a pair of sweatpants, so the genes could be tested to find out if that was actually blood or some other substance.
So, as it turned out, after the pants were examined by forensics, the dots, they're not human blood, they are ink, as Caron said they were.
But we still wondered if he had anything to do with this because he was the last one to see George alive. Ricky was concerned, nervous. He says he was on his way to have breakfast and saw the police activity and decided to stop and see what was going on. To me, it's not a coincidence that he's showing up.
They questioned Ricky Caron about the prior day. What happened after everyone left but you?
We had a little more small talk, George and I, talking about how he had some land for sale somewhere up north.
You left George's house. Do you know what time it was roughly?
Well, I know when I left, it was dusk. I had to go pick up my girlfriend then. And that was the last time I saw my friend.
Ricky talked about going to the Aloha restaurant in Manchester. And I personally talked to a bartender, and she verified that he had been there.
Ricky Caron did not kill his friend. He had no opportunity to kill his friend. So they asked Ricky Caron, did George say what he was going to do for the rest of the evening? Well, he did say Arthur was going to come by later, George's handyman.
You always look at who's the last person to see him alive. We ended up reaching out to Arthur and told him that, we need to speak with him.
Arthur Collins was interviewed by me and by Jim White of the state police.
Arthur, could you just tell us a little bit about your relationship with George?
Yes. I met him at the pawn shop. He's my friend. We drink buddies too now.
Arthur Collins does have a long association with the victim. He does odd jobs for him.
Wednesday afternoon, what was your contact with George?
He said, come over and get a couple of junk cars I had. So I did. I had to fix the tire for him. So I made another trip and dropped the tire off.
Arthur says, I got there at 7 o'clock. We had a couple of beers.
I had 2 girls and then I went home.
What time did you get home on Wednesday evening?
I'd say 9:30.
We know from the neighbors that the shots were heard, the fatal shots, at 10:48 p.m. Mr. Collins has a solid alibi.
We felt suspicious about Arthur Collins because the way he interviewed, he was nervous. But after checking the alibi and finding out that what he said was verified by his wife, he dropped off the suspect list.
So who came by after Arthur Collins left and wound up killing our victim? In every murder case, it's always interesting to speak to who found the body. Did you know to find it because you created it? George's body was initially discovered by his business partner, Glenn Baruti. They'd been partners for several years in the pawn shop. I buy and sell everything. Everyone in town describes him as George's best friend.
We had gone into the pawn shop. We spoke with Glenn.
I was supposed to meet him at his house. He was planning on taking a trip to Thailand at the end of the month. And he's got animals that have to be taken care of out there.
So that's supposedly why Glenn went over there, to be taught how to take care of the animals while George was out of the country.
I pulled in a little after 9. I saw his front door was open. I walked in the house figuring, he was in the shower or something.
Describe to me what you saw when you looked into his bedroom.
It looked like he was asleep in his bed, and I said, hey, get up, your animals are hungry. He didn't move. And then when I walked over the bed, I saw it looked like his brain or something coming out here. And I ran out of there.
Now, Bartis expects to hear the next thing is that he called 911. He didn't do that. Baruti says something off the wall.
I didn't know what to do. I went to my father. I said, you gotta call the police. I can't do it.
You didn't speak with the police?
No.
The fact that he rushed out of there to his father's house without calling the police, it's very odd.
And one thing you don't like when you're a homicide detective is something being odd.
What time you closed the business last night at?
Yeah, 7 o'clock.
And then what did you do?
I went right home. Ate leftover turkey and ham and stuff. I read Bike magazine in bed and shut my light. And that was it.
Okay, what time about did you think that was?
It had to be a little after 9.
Glenn Baruti does not have a verifiable alibi of any kind. So investigators try a different angle. Bartis asks Glenn if he can take a look at the pawn shop's records.
Glenn was very, very forthcoming. He let us into his office.
So they're going through paperwork. And inadvertently and innocently, they come across a recent last will and testament of George Jodoin. Ooh, look at this.
George had changed the will and put everything in Glenn's name.
So he was going to be the heir of everything. He had the business, the house, the boat. So Glenn had the most to gain. And I felt he's the man that committed the homicide.
They have encountered no one else with a motive like this. And it is one hell of a motive. New Hampshire detectives are looking into the violent death of George Jodoin, and the natural emerging suspect is Glenn Baruti, his business partner and heir to George Jodoin's fortune.
We did a polygraph. The polygraph came out inconclusive. We also did a surveillance. We followed him all night, and it was uneventful. We didn't develop anything. Outside of our, the old police gut feeling, we really had nothing on him.
He has suspicions, yes, but there's no such crime as suspicion.
During the whole investigation of George's homicide, we interviewed many people, friends, business associates, and none of it ever developed anything serious to give us a solid suspect. We ran out of leads, and the case went ice cold.
Are you frustrated at this point?
I don't get mad. It's not my personality. I did my job, did the best we could. In law enforcement, we know that somewhere along the line, even if a case goes cold, somebody's going to talk.
So we're driving on the bridge at the west side. Several times I've heard other people yelling out to say, hey, Bobby, yeah, come get your coffee and all this stuff. People know you around town.
Well, when you're born here, a lot of people know you. And when you work here, especially as a policeman, it makes it easier for people to trust you because they know you. My name is Robert Freitas. I'm born and raised in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm retired from the Manchester Police Department. I think any cop that you talk to who's retired will tell you the same thing. It's the greatest job in the world. So in 2011, I became involved in this case as a member of the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. Members of the Jodoin family had contacted the Cold Case Unit about bringing George's case to the forefront of our investigations. They were very proactive with trying to get information to solve it.
This was a whodunit. The vast majority of homicides in New Hampshire aren't whodunits. There was a lot of talk about this homicide for a long time.
It has a larger impact than you can imagine because it makes us as a community feel safer to have an ending to a case like this.
The whole idea of attacking an inactive murder case is to begin on page 1. Review this case as if it just happened. Take a cold look at this with a new set of eyes.
Bill Barry with the Auburn, New Hampshire Police Department. He was working with me on this case.
Once I get involved with a case, I dig like a pit bull. I was like, I'm not going to let go.
I'd known him for a long time. We think alike. And we kind of gelled together. We came up with a plan to reinvestigate. Reviewing the case, we knew that Ricky Caron, Arthur Collins, and Peter Jobin were there that night. And Glenn Baruti was the one that found George in his bed on that morning of the 27th of December. But was it possible that somebody else could have been involved? We thought potentially, was it maybe a jilted lover, somebody that George may have been involved with at some point?
George Jodwin had a reputation as being a ladies' man. Jealousy is always a powerful emotion. What if he's dating someone and then she discovers that there are other women in his life? Well, hell hath no fury, as they say. So he starts there. Freitas, over time, he meets with many women who have enjoyed George's company. But they all say one thing: he's a gentleman. Not a heartbreaker, but they discover some interesting gossip. There was a rumor that George Jodwin was bisexual.
Through the investigation, there were a lot of weird stories that came out about George.
But no one wants to confirm anything. So they developed no suspects from any of that conversation. Freitas is being thorough. So he continues looking into past relationships, and they come across a woman named Tammy Floyd. And she just so happens to be the sister-in-law of George's handyman, Arthur Collins, typical of a small town.
We went to Tammy's address in Manchester, New Hampshire, to speak with her about a potential relationship that she had with George Jobin. And her daughter, Belinda Floyd, was also there.
While we were talking to Tammy, I had asked her if she had a relationship with George.
Tammy Floyd denied any relationship whatsoever with George Jobin.
So we kind of ruled that out.
At that point, we asked them about any recollection they had of the night of George's homicide.
One thing that Tammy did finally say was, well, my daughter was actually at Arthur's house the night of the murder.
Her daughter, Belinda Floyd, told us she had been at Arthur's home that night playing cards with Arthur's wife.
Freitas thinks this could be a real opening. No one knew Belinda existed.
Belinda was only 16 at the time. She was in school, so she was staying with them over school vacation. One of the questions that I asked Belinda was, what time did Arthur get home the night, December 26th?
Looking back at Arthur's statements to the original detectives, he said it was 9:30 when he got home. Belinda says none of that is true.
She remembered specifically that Arthur came in sometime after midnight that night. He appeared to have been drinking, and he went right to his bed. And there was no other talk with him.
We know the murder took place around 10:48 p.m. That was a key at that point.
That changed everything. It was possible that it was, in fact, Arthur Collins that murdered George Jodwin.
So Freitas goes back and re-interviews the wife of Arthur Collins and says, how certain are you as to what time he came home? She said, I thought it might be 9:30, but it could have been midnight. So they have shot his alibi full of holes. Did they do it with a .44 Magnum? Well, we're about to see.
Arthur Collins was the type of guy that would live paycheck to paycheck some weeks and no paycheck to no paycheck other weeks, and would often pawn property at George's shop in Manchester because he needed money.
It was like Groundhog Day with Arthur Collins, because he would show up, pawn off his tools, get some money, end of the month, come back, retrieve his tools, and then the same thing over and over again. But George was so nice to him that he would give, Arthur extra time to come and retrieve his tools, and he wouldn't even attempt to sell them.
In February of 2012, Bill Barry and I picked up Arthur at his home in Manchester.
The true advantage of a cold case investigator, the element of surprise. 10 years later, when a new policeman knocks on the door, Arthur Collins is hopelessly unprepared. So he's at his weakest point, the perfect time to talk to him.
And we kind of confronted him with the information that we had.
Arthur now says, well, I really don't remember what time I got home. We got pretty drunk.
We knew that he was not being truthful with us. We weren't going to let him off the hook.
So Freitas continues to apply the pressure. How much can I make you believe that you're going to be tortured for the rest of your days on this planet unless you start telling me the truth? Pressure works.
It was at that time that Arthur told us that he was present during the time of George's homicide, but it wasn't him that did it.
He knows who killed George. He's been shielding him for 10 long years. Now we're getting somewhere. At this point in this investigation, Freitas now knows that Arthur Collins, by his own admission, was present when George Jodoin was shot to death.
He just came right out and says, yeah, I was there, but I didn't do it.
Arthur said it was, in fact, James LaRoche that was the one that murdered George Jodoin.
They never heard of this name. James LaRoche is cousins with Arthur's wife.
Arthur told us that he had gone back to George's property with Jimmy LaRoche, and the three of them at the property drank. It got to the point where Arthur didn't want to stay anymore. Arthur went out to his vehicle. He started his vehicle up, warmed his vehicle because it was December at the time, so it was cold.
All of a sudden, Arthur heard 3 distinct loud gunshots, and he saw muzzle flashes in the upstairs bedroom window.
And then Jim LaRoche came running out.
Got into his truck and said, I hurt George bad. We need to get out of here. So Arthur then drove James LaRoche back to Manchester, where he dropped him off at his residence on the west side. Arthur did admit at that point that he lied about his timeline account because he was afraid of what James LaRoche may do to him.
The cat is out of the bag, Arthur, and we're under no obligation to ignore it. James LaRoche now becomes suspect number 1. So Freitas rounds up James LaRoche and brings him in.
I had kind of asked Jimmy LaRoche, what does he remember about George's homicide? And he says immediately, I know nothing, very abruptly, very fast.
He said, not only didn't I not do this, I wasn't even there because I was in Florida at the time.
So at that point, he said that he was done talking with us and didn't want to be bothered anymore. So we did some research, and from some Manchester police reports that we were able to dig up, we knew that James LaRoche was not in Florida at the time of George's homicide, that he was in fact in Manchester.
So he's trying to provide an alibi, and instead he provides a lie. It's never good to lie to the police, because they're going to make you eat it. So Freitas thinks, all right, Arthur, you say this is what happened, so we're going to set you up with a recorded telephone, and you're going to talk to James LaRoche and bring up this murder and see what happens.
Arthur was very cooperative and appreciative of the fact that we were trying to eliminate him as a suspect.
He's been trying to talk to me every day, and I'm getting sick of it.
Hey, don't do that. My phone goes off all day long, too, so...
Did you tell anybody about that, or...?
Tell anybody about what? What night? What night are you talking about?
The night we were out there.
I wasn't out there with you.
Jim LaRoche had, was kind of dodging the questions. You could tell he was thrown off guard.
So why did you have to shoot him then?
Who?
You.
I didn't shoot him. Crazy.
James LaRoche denied any involvement in the homicide, told Arthur, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. This is crazy.
I don't know nothing, Arthur. Because I didn't do anything, so I don't know nothing.
James LaRoche doesn't say anything about the murder. He doesn't say anything about anything.
At that point, Bill and I met with James LaRoche and convinced him to take a polygraph examination concerning his involvement in the Jodoin homicide. And that test was administered by Sergeant Scott Gilbert. Scott was a member of the cold case unit with me.
James LaRoche was convincing that he was sitting for this because he didn't do it. And I assured him that if he didn't have any involvement in this, that he was going to pass this polygraph exam and detectives can move on. He answered all my questions without hesitation. We discussed whether he was responsible for this, and he showed no deception.
Scotty came out and said he passed with flying colors. He didn't do it.
Investigators asked LaRoche why did he lie about being in Florida at the time of George's murder.
And he said, well, I was drinking heavily and I black out a lot.
He made a comment to us that most of 2001 was a blank to him.
That's a reasonable statement. So all this time, Arthur Collins has been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself and onto his wife's cousin, James LaRoche.
He was blaming someone else that actually wasn't even there.
He thinks this plan is going to work, which wouldn't make any sense to a 6-year-old, but Arthur isn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. Thank you so much for being an idiot. We're now in a position to shove this down your throat.
So I wanted to speak with Arthur and get him to take a polygraph. And he agreed to take it. On the day that we were supposed to do it, and we went to pick him up, he was not home. Arthur ghosted us. For about 3 weeks, he won't answer phone calls. We go to his home, he won't answer the door. He was making himself scarce.
Arthur is in the wind. He doesn't want to talk about this polygraph because he knows what that could mean. And so does Freitas. So he devises a better plan.
We sat here, we made a call to him, telling him that we were going to come by his house around 11 to speak with him.
He sets up a tactical team around Arthur's house, so there is no escape by car from his home. Trap is set. Let's see if it springs.
Waited, and we saw him emerge from his building to get into his vehicle. He was beating feet to get out of the area before we got there. And as he passed here, the TAC team got behind him down here and made a stop. The officers that approached him in the car had full tactical gear. I think it had a psychological effect on him. I think in his mind, he's thinking that, am I getting arrested for a homicide?
It's easy to mess with someone's head when it's filled with fear. Arthur is a ball of yarn. Freitas is the cat.
A short time later, Bobby and I pulled up behind him. We said, what's going on, Arthur?
And I explained to him, if you take the polygraph examination and you pass it, we won't bother you again. So he agreed to do that.
Well, I appreciate you coming in today so we could get this resolved.
Yeah.
So now here is Arthur in the hot seat. We hook him up to a box and start asking him questions about the murder of George Jodewin.
He was very quiet. He didn't really speak unless spoken to, but he was adamant that he wasn't involved in it.
Just be truthful. Yeah. All right. Ready?
Yeah.
Did you shoot that man?
No.
I could immediately see that this is not going to be good for him.
Relax.
Arthur Collins failed the polygraph examination.
The only question he doesn't fail is your name Arthur Collins?
I set him back down, and I told him.
What? Jim LaRoche did not shoot George Jodewin.
No?
No.
Like that.
Well, I'm hoping you're gonna tell me, because now I know for a fact that you've lied to me.
I did?
And yeah, you lied to me.
He's telling Arthur Collins chapter and verse the lies he's telling, causing Arthur to wind up like a $2 watch.
Please don't keep it to yourself. It's the last thing you want to do.
You know.
He didn't get up and run out or say, I want a lawyer. I knew that there was more for him to say. And then I bring the detectives in, and they have further conversation with him.
Arthur then admitted that he's the one that pulled the trigger, that he's the one that killed George. He didn't seem emotional. It was just matter of fact.
Arthur said that he arrived at George's home that evening after fixing the tire, that the two had engaged in some drinking. Arthur claimed that George had attempted to sexually assault him at the table, and then George grabbed him and took him into the bedroom.
Okay, all right, so what happens next?
He's just trying to do stuff to me, grabbing me and stuff.
Arthur says that George unbuckles his pants and, quote, tried to put his thing in my mouth. Well, okay.
How do you get away from George?
I just took off and went right out there and couldn't believe somebody was trying to do that to me.
According to him, he was extremely angry, enraged. He took the gun, went back into the bedroom.
Did George say anything to you?
No. I just pointed at him and the thing went off. It went off like a hair trigger. It was really fast, and then I ran out of here.
So it has a hair trigger and it just went off. And then it went off again. And then it went off again. So the gun decided to fire 3 times because you contacted it mentally? Nothing even makes any sense. He's become a babbling idiot. So there is Arthur's story. The detectives are grateful to have it because a confession is a confession.
I don't believe his account that George Jodwin sexually assaulted him is true. I don't believe that at all.
It is clear at the moment this occurs, Jodwin is so drunk he falls face down in the bed and goes to sleep. You want us to believe that he was going to sexually assault you and tried to? I don't think so. Further conversations with Glenn Baruti, his business partner, reveal a different set of facts.
Earlier in the day, on December 26th of 2001, George had called Glenn to get some advice on Arthur's request to pawn his tow truck for money.
He was specifically looking for approximately $3,000.
The issue with the pawn of the truck was that Arthur wanted to keep the truck and wanted the money. And Glenn didn't think that was a good idea.
Although it can't be proven, the likely scenario is that George Jodwin probably told him, "You're a nice kid, Arthur, but we can't justify the loan, and I'm going to have to say no."
It's possible that Arthur may have left the residence. George had gotten into bed to go to sleep for the night.
Arthur sits in his truck and he stews. He's on the point of boiling. And Arthur becomes furious because he really needs that money. Arthur walks right back in, picks up the gun, and goes upstairs. George is laying face down in the bed. And boom, boom, boom.
My thought is, after he did that, Arthur was going through the dresser drawers looking for money.
I believe that it was pure and simple. It was money. He was a desperate guy who needed cash.
Despite Arthur's confession, the .44 Magnum is never recovered.
He disposed of that weapon and holster in the salvage yard in Manchester. It was crushed and possibly transported overseas for recycling. After Arthur's polygraph examination, his confession, we took him into custody.
When they made the arrest of Arthur Collins, against my personality, I got angry because I said, damn, we missed it. But I think the people in Auburn will believe that now it's come to a close.
So Arthur Collins, in July of 2015, pled to second-degree murder, and he received a sentence of 30 years to life.
One of the sad parts about this is the fact that George treated him really well, and there was no reason for Arthur to do what he did to him.
Murder has no.
There are murders that happen because of rage. There are murders that happen because of greed. And then there are murders committed because an entire community slowly convinces itself that killing is the same thing as justice. On a freezing winter night in rural Ontario, sometime after midnight, a group of armed men stepped quietly through the snow toward a lonely farmhouse. The moon offered little light. Clouds swallowed most of the sky, leaving only the faint outline of bare trees standing like silent witnesses over endless fields of white. Every footstep disappeared beneath fresh snow, as though nature itself had decided to erase the evidence before the crime had even begun. Inside the farmhouse, the family was asleep. The fire in the stove had begun to fade. The windows were dark. Nothing suggested that within minutes, this home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in Canadian history. No one screamed for help in time. No neighbor rushed across the fields. No sheriff arrived before dawn. Because by the time anyone dared to approach the burning house, 5 people would already be dead. Their names would become part of Canadian folklore. Their killers would walk away. And nearly a century and a half later, people would still argue over the same haunting question. Were the Black Donnellys a family of violent criminals who finally met the consequences of their own actions? Or were they victims of hatred so deeply rooted that an entire community allowed murder to masquerade as righteousness? The answer is far more complicated than either version suggests. Long before the fire. Long before the guns. Long before the bodies. There was something far more dangerous growing inside Biddulph Township. Fear. Suspicion. Rumors repeated so often that they slowly transformed into unquestioned truth. Every isolated dispute became another piece of evidence. Every fight became another story. Every accusation became another reason to believe that the Donnellys were different from everyone else. Perhaps dangerous. Perhaps guilty. Perhaps beyond saving. When enough people begin believing the same story, proof becomes less important than reputation. That is how communities begin to fracture. That is how neighbors become enemies. And sometimes, that is how ordinary men convince themselves that murder is simply another form of duty. The Black Donnelly massacre did not begin on February 4, 1880. It began years earlier. Maybe decades earlier. It began every time someone repeated a rumor without knowing whether it was true. It began every time resentment was allowed to grow instead of fade. It began every time violence was answered with more violence. The final attack lasted only a short time. The hatred that fueled it had taken generations to build. Imagine standing outside that farmhouse before sunrise. The air is so cold it hurts to breathe. Ash drifts silently across the frozen ground. The smell of burned timber mixes with smoke that still rises from what remains of a family's home. Somewhere beneath blackened beams lie parents who had spent decades trying to build a life in a new country. Nearby rests a daughter whose future ended before daylight. A son whose final moments unfolded inside the house he believed would keep him safe. Another son lies dead somewhere else, killed not because anyone proved his guilt, but because a crowd had already reached its verdict. No courtroom. No jury. No defense. Only fire. Only bullets. Only certainty born from anger. Yet what makes this story unforgettable is not simply the brutality of the murders. History has seen crimes far bloodier than this one. What makes this case extraordinary is what happened afterward. Or more accurately, what never happened afterward. There would be arrests. There would be witnesses. There would be investigations. There would even be trials. But despite dozens of people allegedly knowing exactly who participated in the attack, despite survivors naming faces they recognized, despite the entire township whispering the same names behind closed doors, not a single person would ever be convicted for the killings. The law arrived. Justice never did. That failure transformed the massacre into something larger than a murder case. It became a symbol. A warning. An uncomfortable reminder that the greatest threat to justice is not always the absence of laws. Sometimes it is the silence of ordinary people. Silence has a strange power. It protects the guilty. It isolates the innocent. It allows memory to fade until myths become stronger than facts. For decades after the massacre, families living in the area rarely spoke openly about what had happened. Children grew up hearing fragments instead of complete stories. A burned farmhouse. Masked men. Shots in the darkness. A little boy who survived by hiding beneath a bed while death walked through the house above him. Some claimed the Donnellys had deserved everything. Others insisted they had been hunted because they were outsiders. Most simply chose not to speak at all. Silence became another inheritance passed from one generation to the next. That silence still echoes today. Because every version of this story reflects the person telling it. To some, the Donnellys were ruthless troublemakers who brought disaster upon themselves. To others, they were immigrants struggling to survive in a hostile settlement where prejudice carried more weight than evidence. Between those two extremes lies a far more unsettling possibility. That neither side was completely innocent. And yet no imperfection, no bad reputation, no history of conflict can ever justify what happened in the early hours of that winter morning. This is not merely the story of a family. It is the story of what happens when justice leaves the courtroom and enters the hands of a crowd. Because crowds do not investigate. Crowds do not deliberate. Crowds do not doubt themselves. Crowds only move forward. And once they begin moving, stopping them becomes almost impossible. The men who approached the Donnelly farmhouse that night almost certainly believed they were restoring order. Some carried rifles. Some carried clubs. Some carried lanterns whose flames danced against the snow with every step. Perhaps a few hesitated. Perhaps one looked toward the house and wondered whether they had gone too far. If anyone did, history never recorded it. What history remembers instead is the fire. The smoke climbing into the winter sky. The silence that followed. The unanswered questions. The trials that produced no justice. The families forever divided by memory. The legends that blurred into history. And one haunting realization. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not strangers hiding in the darkness. Sometimes they are neighbors walking together beneath the same moon, believing with absolute certainty that what they are about to do is right. This is the story of the Black Donnelly Massacre. A story where truth became tangled with rumor. Where law surrendered to vengeance. Where an entire community stood at the edge of civilization and, for one terrible night, chose to step into something far darker. Long before the Black Donnelly name became attached to one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history, there was only wilderness. The land that would one day become Biddulph Township was harsh, isolated, and unforgiving. Endless forests stretched across southern Ontario, interrupted only by narrow trails carved through dense hardwood and cedar. Winters settled over the countryside with relentless determination. Snow-buried fences, swallowed roads, and transformed familiar landscapes into silent white expanses where even the nearest neighbor could disappear behind drifting curtains of ice. For those willing to risk everything, however, this wilderness also represented possibility. During the middle decades of the 19th century, thousands of immigrants crossed the Atlantic carrying little more than hope. Many had left Ireland after years marked by poverty, political unrest, and famine. Some escaped empty fields where crops had failed. Others fled landlords who controlled every aspect of their lives. Canada promised land, opportunity, and a future earned through hard work rather than inherited privilege. But promises made from afar rarely survived first contact with reality. A parcel of land in Ontario was not a ready-made farm waiting for its owner. It was a forest demanding to be conquered one tree at a time. Families spent years cutting timber, pulling stumps from frozen earth, stacking stones into rough property lines, and building homes with their own hands. Every cleared acre represented thousands of hours of exhausting labor. Nothing came easily. Food had to be grown. Animals had to survive brutal winters. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks in spring and frozen ruts in winter. A doctor might live several miles away. A church could require half a day's travel. The nearest town often felt like another world. Life demanded resilience. It also demanded cooperation. Neighbors borrowed horses, shared tools, helped raise barns, and gathered during harvests because survival depended upon one another. Yet beneath that fragile cooperation rested another truth. Land was valuable, reputations mattered, and small disagreements could linger for decades. Every fence became important. Every property line mattered. Every accusation carried consequences. It was into this uncertain world that James Donnelly and his wife Johanna arrived after leaving Ireland in the 1840s. Like countless other immigrants, they were not wealthy. They possessed no grand estate and no political influence. They carried determination instead. The kind of determination common among people who had already survived hardship before ever setting foot in Canada. Together they settled along a concession road that became known as Roman Line, an isolated farming community populated largely by Irish Catholic immigrants. At first glance, the settlement appeared united by language, religion, and shared ancestry. But communities are rarely as simple as they appear. Old rivalries crossed the Atlantic with the immigrants. Family feuds survived the ocean voyage. Differences in wealth, personality, and ambition gradually widened into lasting divisions. Every settlement develops its own unwritten social rules. People learn who commands respect, whose opinion carries weight, and which families should never be crossed. The Donnellys never fit comfortably inside those expectations. James Donnelly was known as a stubborn man. He worked hard, but he was equally willing to defend what he believed belonged to him. Arguments rarely ended with polite disagreement. They often became public confrontations remembered for years afterward. Johanna matched her husband in determination. Running a frontier household demanded strength beyond physical endurance. She raised children, managed daily responsibilities, cared for livestock, prepared food, and helped maintain the farm through every season. Those who underestimated her quickly discovered that she possessed both intelligence and resolve. Together they built not only a home but a large family. Their children grew into adulthood surrounded by hard labor and constant challenges. They learned to split wood before sunrise, repair fences after storms, and tend fields whose harvest determined whether winter would be comfortable or desperate. From the outside, their lives resembled countless other farming families scattered across Ontario. Inside the community, however, perceptions slowly began to change. Stories spread. Some involved disputes over livestock wandering onto neighboring land. Others described heated fights. Still others accused members of the family of intimidation, violence, or destruction of property. Whether every accusation reflected reality is impossible to determine today. Records from the period often mixed verified events with rumor. Newspapers favored dramatic accounts. Personal grudges influenced testimony. Oral traditions changed with every generation that repeated them. What remains certain is that the Donnellys developed a reputation unlike any other family in Biddulph Township. Some feared them. Some admired their refusal to be bullied. Others blamed them whenever conflict emerged. Reputation possesses a strange kind of gravity. Once established, it attracts every new accusation. When two strangers argue, people ask what happened. When someone with a notorious reputation argues, people assume they already know the answer. That pattern slowly surrounded the Donnelly family. Every disagreement reinforced existing beliefs. Every confrontation strengthened community divisions. The truth became increasingly difficult to separate from expectation. Yet the Donnellys were not isolated criminals living apart from society. They attended church. They farmed. They traded with neighbors. Their children grew up alongside other local families. Life continued despite underlying tension. Years passed. Seasons changed. Fields expanded as forests retreated. Children became adults. Roads slowly improved. The settlement itself matured. But resentment often matures alongside prosperity. As land values increased, ownership disputes became more significant. What might once have been settled with conversation now involved lawyers, petitions, or lasting hostility. 4 immigrant families who had sacrificed everything to claim a piece of Canada. Losing land meant losing the future itself. Few issues produced stronger emotions. The Donnellys found themselves involved in several conflicts over the years, each adding another layer to their public image. Some incidents resulted in criminal charges. Some ended in acquittals. Others remained unresolved, leaving each side convinced of its own righteousness. In isolated communities, memory never fades quickly. A fight witnessed by 20 people can still shape opinions 20 years later. Children inherit stories from parents. Neighbors repeat familiar narratives. Eventually the stories become part of local identity. By the late 1870s, the Donnelly name no longer described only one family. It represented an idea. To supporters, it symbolized resilience against persecution. To critics, it symbolized lawlessness. Neither image fully captured reality. Like most families, the Donnellys contained ordinary people trying to navigate extraordinary circumstances. They celebrated births, mourned deaths, worked exhausting days, argued among themselves, laughed during holidays, and dreamed about better seasons ahead. History often reduces people to symbols. Real life rarely does. As another winter settled over Ontario in 1879, the frozen fields concealed tensions that had accumulated over decades. Snow covered wagon tracks and property lines alike, but it could not bury resentment. The community appeared peaceful. Smoke rose from chimneys each morning. Church bells still gathered worshippers. Children still played between farmhouses. Farmers still exchanged greetings along icy roads. Yet beneath those familiar routines lingered suspicion waiting for another spark. No one could know that spark would arrive before spring. No one could know that one accusation, whether true or false, would ignite emotions powerful enough to transform neighbors into executioners. And when that moment finally came, the quiet landscape of Biddulph Township would never again be remembered for its forests, its farms, or its determined settlers. It would be remembered for the night when years of resentment erupted into violence, forever binding the name Black Donnelly to one of Canada's most enduring and unsettling mysteries. Q history has a habit of introducing people at the moment they die. A headline appears. A courtroom record survives. A weathered photograph is preserved inside a museum archive. Generations later, the victims become names attached to tragedy, remembered only for the final hours of their lives. Everything that came before slowly disappears behind the violence that ended their story. The Black Donnellys have often suffered that fate. For many people, they exist only as a family standing inside a burning farmhouse on a cold February morning in 1880. Yet before they became victims, they were simply a family. Like countless farming households scattered across rural Ontario, their days followed rhythms dictated not by clocks but by seasons. Dawn arrived with work already waiting. Livestock needed feeding before breakfast. Water had to be carried. Wood had to be split. Fences demanded repair after heavy snow or violent winds. Every member of the household understood that comfort was earned through labor. The Donnelly farm was not luxurious. It was practical. Every object inside the home existed because someone had built it, repaired it, or relied upon it every single day. Boots drying beside the stove carried the stains of muddy fields. Rough wooden chairs bore scratches from years of use. Shelves held jars carefully preserved through warmer months, insurance against the unforgiving Canadian winter. Nothing inside the house suggested wealth. Everything suggested perseverance. At the center of that household stood James Donnelly. By 1880, James was no longer a young immigrant struggling to establish himself. Decades of physical labor had reshaped his body. Farming leaves its own signature upon a person. Hands grow thick with calluses. Shoulders carry years of lifting timber and stone. Faces become weathered by summer heat and winter winds alike. James possessed that appearance. Those who knew him often described him as stubborn, a man unlikely to retreat once he believed he was right. Throughout his life he had become involved in arguments that reinforced his reputation across the township. Some conflicts reached the courts. Others ended only after tempers cooled or neighbors chose to avoid one another altogether. But reputation reveals only part of a life. It says little about ordinary mornings spent repairing broken equipment. It says nothing about evenings gathered around a family table. It ignores the quiet responsibilities that filled most of his days. To his children, James was not a local legend. He was their father. He expected hard work because survival required it. Every acre of farmland represented years of sacrifice. Every successful harvest meant another season endured. Standing beside him through every hardship was Johanna Donnelly. If James provided the physical foundation of the household, Johanna held its emotional center together. Life for a frontier mother demanded extraordinary endurance. Before sunrise she was already preparing meals, tending fires, organizing supplies, caring for younger family members, and ensuring that every small necessity of daily life continued without interruption. Her work rarely appeared in official records. History often overlooks women whose labor occurred within the walls of the home. Yet farms like the Donnellys could not have survived without them. Johanna understood every corner of the household. She knew which food stores would last until spring. She remembered birthdays, illnesses, family disagreements, and small triumphs that never reached public attention. She watched children become adults. She buried loved ones when disease claimed lives too early. She welcomed visitors despite knowing that not everyone entered the property with friendly intentions. Years of community tension had undoubtedly affected her. Rumors have a way of reaching every doorstep. No mother remains untouched when she hears neighbors speak her family's name with suspicion. Still, daily life continued. Meals were prepared. Laundry was washed. Animals required care regardless of personal worries. The seasons showed little concern for human conflict. Among the children still living close to home was Thomas Donnelly. Thomas had grown into adulthood beneath the weight of his family's complicated reputation. Unlike later generations reading history books, he never possessed the luxury of separating rumor from reality. Community opinion surrounded him every day. He worked the land alongside his family. He shared responsibilities that had defined the household since childhood. Neighbors observing him might have seen only another Donnelly. His parents saw the son they had raised. Family relationships are always more intimate than public reputation allows. Arguments occurred. Laughter echoed through the home. Plans for future harvests replaced discussions of old disputes. The Donnellys were capable of ordinary happiness despite extraordinary pressure. Bridget Donnelly also remained part of the household. Historical records preserve relatively little about her personal thoughts or ambitions, leaving modern readers with only fragments. That silence itself reveals something important about the 19th century. Women's inner lives were rarely documented unless extraordinary events forced them into public attention. Bridget almost certainly contributed to the endless responsibilities of farm life. She cooked. She cleaned. She mended clothing. She helped wherever necessary because every pair of hands mattered. Had history taken a different path, her life might have passed quietly into old age without ever appearing in newspapers or courtroom testimony. Instead, violence transformed her into one of history's remembered victims. It is easy to imagine these individuals only through the lens of the coming tragedy. Yet there were ordinary evenings before everything changed. The family gathered for supper after exhausting days outside. Conversation drifted between practical concerns and familiar routines. Perhaps someone complained about the weather. Perhaps another discussed livestock or repairs needing attention once spring arrived. No one around the table could measure how much time remained. Outside the farmhouse, winter wrapped the countryside in silence. Inside, warmth lingered near the stove. Light from oil lamps softened rough wooden walls built through decades of effort. These small moments rarely survive in historical records. They survive only because they existed in every family. That ordinary humanity is what makes the coming violence so devastating. The Donnellys were controversial. Some members had participated in conflicts over the years. Some accusations carried substance. Others remain impossible to verify. Acknowledging those realities does not erase their humanity. Nor does it diminish the horror that awaited them. By the closing months of 1879, tension within Biddulph Township had intensified once again. The burning of a neighbor's barn reignited long-standing suspicions. Although no court proved the Donnellys responsible, many local residents believed they already knew the truth. Belief became stronger than evidence. Conversations changed. Friendly greetings became shorter. Eyes lingered a little longer when members of the family passed along the road. Invisible lines divided the community into those willing to defend the Donnellys and those convinced they represented a danger to everyone around them. The family could almost certainly sense that change. Communities communicate fear without speaking it aloud. Doors close more quickly. Invitations become less frequent. Ordinary silence begins to carry unusual meaning. Whether the Donnellys fully understood the danger facing them remains impossible to know. Perhaps they believed previous conflicts would eventually fade as others had before. Perhaps they assumed the legal system, however imperfect, would prevent anyone from taking justice into their own hands. Perhaps they simply refused to imagine that neighbors could commit the unthinkable. History grants readers the terrible advantage of hindsight. The family possessed no such privilege. When they prepared for bed on the evening of February 3, 1880, they followed routines repeated countless times before. Fires were checked. Doors secured. Lamps extinguished one by one until darkness settled over the farmhouse. Outside, winter winds crossed empty fields. Snow reflected faint moonlight. Nothing about the landscape revealed that armed men were already making decisions that would soon erase an entire family's future. Inside the house, parents slept believing tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Children closed their eyes expecting another morning of ordinary work. No one knew that this would be their final night together beneath the roof they had spent decades building. No one imagined that before sunrise, their home would stand in flames, their names would become inseparable from one of Canada's greatest unsolved crimes, and the story of the Black Donnellys would pass forever from the private world of one family into the permanent memory of history. Night settled over Biddulph Township with the quiet certainty that only a Canadian winter could bring. The fields lay buried beneath deep snow, their familiar boundaries softened into pale ribbons stretching toward the darkness. The trees stood motionless, their bare branches outlined against a sky heavy with low clouds. Every farmhouse along Roman line had retreated into the comfort of lamplight hours earlier. Fires burned low inside stone hearths. Doors had been barred against the cold. Families had surrendered themselves to sleep, trusting that the silence outside meant safety. At the Donnelly farmhouse, the evening had ended much like countless others before it. The day's work was finished. Boots had been left near the door to dry. The stove still radiated enough warmth to push back the bitter air pressing against the walls. One by one, the lights disappeared until the house was swallowed by darkness. James Donnelly rested after another ordinary day on the farm. Johanna settled into the familiar comfort of routine that had carried her through decades of marriage, hardship, and endless work. Thomas and Bridget retired knowing that another morning would almost certainly begin before sunrise, just as it always had. Outside, however, another routine was unfolding. Across the frozen countryside, men began leaving their own homes. Some traveled alone. Others moved in pairs. Their destinations were different, but their purpose was the same. No bells announced their gathering. No official authority had summoned them. No warrant had been signed. The meeting belonged to men who had convinced themselves that the law had failed and that justice now rested in their own hands. Many of them had spent months listening to stories about the Donnellys. Some believed the family had terrorized neighbors for years. Others were convinced that recent crimes, including the burning of a nearby barn, proved that stronger action had become necessary. Whether those beliefs were supported by evidence no longer seemed to matter. Something far more dangerous had replaced evidence. Certainty. The group assembled quietly in the darkness. Faces were partially hidden beneath winter clothing pulled high against the freezing wind. Heavy coats concealed weapons carried for the journey ahead. Rifles rested against shoulders. Clubs and sticks were gripped inside thick gloves. Lanterns cast trembling circles of yellow light across the snow before being lowered or extinguished whenever secrecy became more important than visibility. No one spoke loudly. The frozen air carried sound across remarkable distances. Instead, brief exchanges passed between the men. A nod. A gesture. A reminder of where they were going. Every step compressed fresh snow beneath heavy boots, leaving a trail that would soon disappear beneath drifting powder. The march toward the Donnelly farm had begun. As they advanced along Roman line, the silence became almost unsettling. The only movement came from shadows crossing open fields and narrow roads. The farmhouse gradually emerged ahead of them, little more than a dark outline against the pale landscape. No lights burned inside. Everyone appeared asleep. For a brief moment, the group paused. It remains impossible to know what thoughts passed through individual minds during those final seconds before the attack. Perhaps some believed they were about to arrest dangerous men. Perhaps others already expected violence. Perhaps a few questioned whether events had gone too far but lacked the courage to turn back. History preserves no answers. It records only what followed. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, the quiet ended. The attackers surged toward the farmhouse. The distance between accusation and violence vanished in an instant. The door was forced open. The peaceful rhythm of sleeping occupants shattered into confusion. Those inside awoke not to the sound of an ordinary disturbance but to strangers invading the place where they should have been safest. Dark figures flooded into the house. The warmth of the family home was suddenly replaced by fear. James Donnelly had only moments to understand what was happening. The men confronting him had not come to argue. They had not come to negotiate. Witness accounts collected later indicated that the assault was immediate and overwhelming. James was struck and shot during the attack. His age and experience offered no protection against a crowd determined to overpower anyone who resisted. Johanna faced the same brutal reality. The woman who had spent decades building and protecting her household found herself surrounded by armed intruders inside the very home she had helped create. The sanctuary of family life disappeared beneath sudden violence. Thomas became another target. Whether he attempted to defend himself or those around him cannot be fully reconstructed today. The chaos inside the farmhouse unfolded in only a matter of minutes, leaving investigators with fragmented testimony rather than a complete sequence of events. Bridget also became trapped inside the nightmare. The attackers showed little distinction between age or circumstance. The house that had sheltered the family through countless winters became the setting for unimaginable terror. Amid the confusion, one child managed to survive. Johnny O'Connor, a young farmhand staying at the Donnelly home that night, reacted with instinct rather than calculation. Instead of running toward the door or calling for help, he slipped beneath a bed. Hidden in darkness, he remained absolutely still. Above him, heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor. Voices echoed through the room. The sounds of violence unfolded only a few feet away. Every passing second carried the possibility that someone would kneel, look beneath the bed, and discover him. He did not move. He scarcely dared to breathe. For a frightened child, time no longer followed its normal pace. Seconds stretched into what felt like endless minutes. Fear narrowed his entire world to splintered floorboards, drifting dust, and the terrifying uncertainty of whether he would live to see morning. The attackers believed they had eliminated everyone inside. Their attention turned toward destroying the house itself. Fuel was spread through parts of the building. Within moments, flames began consuming the wooden structure. Fire behaves differently during winter. The surrounding landscape remains frozen, but dry timber burns with astonishing speed once the blaze takes hold. Orange light burst through windows that had been dark only minutes before. Thick smoke rolled upward into the cold night sky, visible for miles across the silent countryside. The farmhouse, built through decades of labor, became an enormous torch against the snow. Inside remained the bodies of James, Johanna, Thomas, and Bridget. The attackers watched long enough to ensure that the fire had taken hold. Then they left. The night, however, was not over. The violence spread beyond the first farmhouse. Members of the group continued toward another nearby residence connected to the Donnelly family. Their objective was William Donnelly. Believing William to be inside, they approached the second house prepared to continue what they had begun. Fate intervened through confusion. When the door opened, the man who appeared was John Donnelly. Accounts indicate that the attackers mistook him for William. Without allowing time to confirm his identity, they opened fire. John collapsed from multiple gunshot wounds. The mistake changed nothing about the attackers' determination. Another member of the Donnelly family lay dead before dawn. William and his wife managed to escape the fate intended for them, surviving only because circumstances unfolded differently than the attackers expected. As the armed men dispersed into the darkness, the countryside gradually returned to silence. The flames continued their work. Snow reflected the glow of the burning farmhouse while smoke drifted high into the winter sky. Neighbors would eventually notice the fire. Some hesitated. Others approached cautiously, uncertain whether danger still remained. By the time anyone reached the property, there was almost nothing left to save. The attack itself had lasted only a short time. Its consequences would endure for generations. In a single winter night, years of resentment had erupted into organized violence. Rumor had become action. Suspicion had become execution. The law had been replaced by a mob convinced that its judgment required no courtroom and no verdict. As dawn slowly approached Biddulph Township, the fire began to weaken. The timbers collapsed inward. Ash settled across the frozen ground. 5 members of one family were dead. One young witness remained alive beneath the weight of memories that would follow him for the rest of his life. The darkest chapter in the history of the Black Donnellys had only just begun. The fire had burned through the darkest hours of the night. Long before the first pale light reached the frozen fields of Biddulph Township, the Donnelly farmhouse had already been reduced to a blackened skeleton standing alone against the winter landscape. Thick columns of smoke drifted lazily into the cold morning air. The flames that had roared so fiercely only hours before were now little more than glowing pockets of embers, hidden beneath collapsed beams. Snow covered everything surrounding the property. It muffled sound. It softened the edges of destruction. Yet nothing could disguise what had happened. The smell reached people before the full scene came into view. Burned timber. Scorched hay. Smoke that clung to clothing and settled heavily inside every breath. For nearby residents, the sight was impossible to ignore. Some had awakened during the night after noticing an unusual glow stretching across the horizon. Others first learned something was wrong when neighbors arrived carrying hurried whispers instead of ordinary morning greetings. A fire. The Donnelly place. Something terrible had happened. Curiosity drew some people toward the farm. Fear slowed others. Few knew exactly what they expected to find. Many still believed the blaze had been an accident. Perhaps a chimney fire. Perhaps a lantern knocked over during the night. No one wanted to imagine that an entire household had been deliberately attacked. As more people approached, conversation faded into uneasy silence. The farmhouse no longer resembled a home. Sections of the roof had collapsed inward. The walls leaned at impossible angles, blackened by intense heat. Furniture had been consumed almost completely, leaving behind twisted fragments buried beneath layers of ash and snow. The yard itself appeared strangely untouched. The surrounding fields remained calm beneath their blanket of white, creating a disturbing contrast between peaceful nature and violent destruction. Footprints marked the snow around the property. Some belonged to those arriving after sunrise. Others had been left during the night. Investigators would later understand that the frozen ground had preserved evidence impossible to ignore. Many tracks approached the farmhouse. Many tracks departed. The patterns suggested not one visitor but a group. Whatever had occurred here had not been the work of a lone individual. As neighbors cautiously moved closer, reality slowly replaced speculation. Human remains lay inside the ruins. Recovering them became an agonizing task. Collapsed beams had to be shifted carefully. Charred debris was pulled away piece by piece. Each discovery deepened the horror. James Donnelly was found among the remains of the house he had spent decades building. The structure that had symbolized everything he and Johanna had worked for had become his final resting place. Nearby lay Johanna. Years of devotion to her family had ended beneath the same roof she had struggled so hard to maintain through countless winters. Thomas and Bridget were also discovered within the ruins. The fire had erased many details investigators desperately needed, but it could not erase the evidence that violence had occurred before the blaze consumed the building. The victims had not simply perished in an accidental house fire. The destruction had been intentional. Word spread through the township with astonishing speed. Small farming communities have always relied upon conversation as their fastest form of communication. Before newspapers could arrive and before official reports could be written, neighbors carried news from one farm to another. By midday, nearly everyone knew. The Donnellys were dead. Some responded with genuine grief. Others reacted with stunned disbelief. A few remained strangely reserved, as though the outcome merely confirmed fears they had held for years. It became increasingly difficult to separate shock from long-standing prejudice. While attention centered upon the burned farmhouse, another grim discovery emerged. John Donnelly had been killed at a separate location during what investigators quickly realized was a second attack. The existence of two connected crime scenes immediately changed the nature of the investigation. This had not been a spontaneous act of violence. It had been organized. The attackers had moved deliberately from one location to another, pursuing members of the same family. That realization sent a chill through the community far deeper than the winter air itself. If neighbors had planned these killings together, then the perpetrators might still be living among everyone else. The local authorities soon arrived. Compared with modern investigators, 19th-century law enforcement possessed few scientific tools. There were no fingerprint databases, no forensic laboratories, no DNA analysis. Crime scenes depended upon careful observation, witness testimony, and physical evidence visible to the human eye. Every surviving detail mattered. The investigators examined the burned remains as thoroughly as circumstances allowed. The condition of the bodies suggested that several victims had suffered violent injuries before the fire. This finding contradicted any theory that the deaths resulted solely from the blaze. Attention shifted toward the footprints surrounding the farmhouse. Although snowfall and later activity had disturbed portions of the scene, enough remained to indicate that multiple individuals had approached and departed together. There was strength in numbers. There was planning. This was not the work of one angry neighbor acting alone. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who had organized the attack? How many men had participated? Who carried the firearms? Who started the fire? Had everyone present intended murder, or had events spiraled beyond the original plan? No physical evidence alone could answer those questions. Investigators desperately needed someone who had witnessed the attack. At first, they believed there were no survivors. Then came an extraordinary discovery. Inside the burned farmhouse, hidden beneath the memory of unimaginable terror, was a frightened young boy who had somehow escaped death. Johnny O'Connor had survived. His body was exhausted. His face carried the shock of someone who had watched the world collapse in a single night. Hours earlier he had hidden beneath a bed while armed men invaded the house. Now he emerged into a morning unlike any he could have imagined. The home around him had vanished. The family that had offered him shelter was gone. Adults surrounded him with urgent questions. Johnny's recollection became the single most valuable piece of evidence available to investigators. He described being awakened by the violent entry of armed men. He remembered voices. He recalled movements inside the house. Most importantly, he believed he recognized several of the attackers. His testimony transformed the investigation immediately. Authorities no longer searched for unknown strangers. They began looking toward members of the local community. That development placed enormous pressure upon everyone involved. The alleged killers were not distant criminals who had disappeared into another province. According to the surviving witness, they were men living nearby. Men whose faces were familiar. Men who attended church. Men whose families continued their ordinary routines while smoke still drifted from the Donnelly farm. As investigators questioned residents, another obstacle quickly became apparent. Fear. People who had spoken freely before the attack suddenly became cautious. Simple questions received uncertain answers. Rumors flourished in private conversation but vanished when officials requested formal statements. Some witnesses admitted hearing unusual activity during the night. Others claimed to know nothing at all. Whether that silence resulted from loyalty, intimidation, uncertainty, or self-preservation remains impossible to determine with complete confidence. Small communities often struggle when criminal investigations point toward their own members. Every answer carries consequences. Every accusation threatens lifelong relationships. Every statement risks retaliation. The atmosphere inside Biddulph Township changed almost overnight. Neighbors began watching one another with suspicion. Conversations ended abruptly whenever unfamiliar faces approached. The massacre had destroyed more than one family. It had shattered trust across an entire community. Investigators soon compiled a growing list of individuals believed to have participated in the attack. The names themselves reflected just how deeply rooted the violence had become. These were not wandering outlaws. They were local men. Farmers. Residents. Members of the same township that had watched resentment grow for years. Yet despite the horrifying nature of the crime and the existence of eyewitness testimony, gathering evidence strong enough to secure convictions would prove extraordinarily difficult. Every passing day allowed memories to fade. Every conversation created opportunities for stories to change. Those responsible had not only attacked a family. They had also attacked in darkness, together, making it increasingly difficult to isolate the actions of any single individual. As the bodies were prepared for burial and the ruins of the farmhouse cooled beneath fresh snow, one uncomfortable realization settled over the investigation. Finding suspects would not be the greatest challenge. Convincing an entire community to testify against its own people would be. The ashes still covered the ground. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air. A young survivor had identified familiar faces. The authorities believed they were close to uncovering the truth. They had no way of knowing that the greatest battle ahead would not take place at the crime scene. It would unfold inside courtrooms, where memory, fear, loyalty, and justice would collide, and where the search for accountability would become almost as tragic as the massacre itself. The morning after the massacre, investigators believed they had something many murder cases never possess. A surviving eyewitness. A crime scene that suggested planning rather than impulse. And a community where almost everyone seemed to have heard the same rumors about who might be responsible. At first glance, the case appeared straightforward. Several members of the Donnelly family had been murdered in a coordinated attack. Their farmhouse had been deliberately set on fire. A second assault had claimed the life of another family member only minutes later. The violence had involved numerous participants rather than a single offender. Such a crime should have produced a long list of witnesses. Instead, it produced silence. The authorities moved quickly. Officers traveled from farm to farm, speaking with residents who had either lived near Roman Line or maintained connections with families in the township. Every conversation followed a familiar pattern. People admitted hearing stories. People acknowledged growing hostility toward the Donnellys. Many quietly repeated the same names. But when asked to provide official statements, certainty suddenly disappeared. No one seemed willing to place those accusations on the public record. Some claimed they had only repeated rumors. Others insisted they had heard nothing at all. The difference between private conversation and sworn testimony became enormous. It soon became clear that fear had entered the investigation. Whether that fear came from loyalty, intimidation, or concern for one's own family was difficult to determine. Biddulph Township was not a large city where strangers disappeared into crowds. Everyone knew everyone. Children attended the same churches. Families traded livestock. Neighbors borrowed equipment. To accuse someone of participating in mass murder meant accusing a person whose relatives might remain only a few miles away. The investigators faced a difficult reality. The closer they came to identifying suspects, the more reluctant witnesses became. Despite those obstacles, authorities gradually assembled enough information to begin making arrests. Approximately 13 men were eventually taken into custody in connection with the massacre. Some had long-standing disputes with the Donnellys. Others were alleged members of the group often referred to as the Vigilance Committee or Peace Society. The organization itself occupied a strange place within local history. Supporters portrayed it as a group formed to maintain order where official law enforcement struggled to do so. Critics viewed it as something far more dangerous. A gathering of ordinary citizens who had gradually convinced themselves that violence could replace justice. Whether every arrested individual had entered the Donnelly farmhouse that night remained uncertain. What investigators needed was evidence linking specific people to specific actions. And almost all of that evidence depended upon human memory. The most important witness remained young Johnny O'Connor. The child had survived only because he hid beneath a bed while armed men moved through the house above him. The psychological burden carried by such a survivor is difficult to imagine. He had witnessed terror in complete darkness. He had listened to voices while fearing every second might be his last. He had emerged from hiding only after the attackers had departed and the farmhouse had become a scene of unimaginable destruction. Yet despite the trauma, Johnny told investigators that he recognized several of the men involved. His testimony represented the strongest connection between the crime and the suspects. Without him, authorities possessed little more than community suspicion. With him, they believed justice might still be possible. Investigators interviewed Johnny repeatedly. They sought consistency. They compared names. They attempted to determine exactly where each individual had stood inside the house and what actions had occurred during the attack. Each interview became an effort to preserve memory before time, fear, or outside influence could reshape it. Meanwhile, defense supporters began constructing their own narrative. They argued that public hatred toward certain individuals had produced reckless accusations. Some questioned whether a frightened child awakened from sleep could accurately identify numerous attackers inside a dark farmhouse during moments of overwhelming panic. Others suggested that conversations after the massacre might have influenced Johnny's recollections. These questions would later become central inside the courtroom. Outside the formal investigation, the township remained deeply divided. For many residents, the arrests brought relief. They believed the authorities had finally acted against those responsible. Others viewed the investigation with skepticism. They questioned whether political pressure and public outrage had encouraged investigators to arrest familiar enemies rather than proven killers. Every new development widened existing fractures inside the community. Church gatherings became uncomfortable. Neighbors who had once greeted one another warmly now exchanged guarded looks. Families found themselves avoiding discussions that inevitably returned to the massacre. The case no longer concerned only the Donnellys. It threatened the stability of the entire township. Investigators also encountered another familiar obstacle in 19th-century criminal cases. Physical evidence was limited. The fire had destroyed much of the farmhouse. Whatever traces the attackers left behind had been consumed by flames, disturbed by rescue efforts, or buried beneath snow. Modern forensic science did not exist. There were no microscopic analyses. No chemical reconstruction of bloodstains. No ballistic comparisons capable of identifying individual firearms with certainty. Instead, investigators relied upon observation. Footprints. Witnesses. Community knowledge. Circumstantial evidence. Each piece alone appeared insufficient. Only together could they form a convincing picture. The challenge was ensuring that every piece survived legal scrutiny. As preparations for trial continued, rumors spread almost as rapidly as official information. Some claimed additional witnesses had privately confessed knowing the attackers. Others insisted certain suspects had openly discussed the assault before changing their stories. Whether those rumors contained truth became increasingly difficult to establish. The investigation itself had become part of the community's ongoing conflict. Every conversation risked contamination. Every memory risked alteration. Human beings rarely remember traumatic events exactly as they occurred. Fear compresses time. Shock distorts detail. Later discussions unconsciously reshape recollection. Investigators understood these difficulties even if they lacked the psychological language used today. They recognized that delays weakened testimony. Yet immediate questioning also carried problems because traumatized witnesses often struggled to organize their memories. The Black Donnelly investigation unfolded within those competing realities. Every day mattered. Every delay benefited uncertainty. Authorities hoped that bringing the suspects before the courts would finally replace rumor with evidence. They underestimated how powerful community loyalty could become once formal proceedings began. As the case advanced, witnesses who had previously appeared cooperative became hesitant. Some altered portions of earlier statements. Others suddenly claimed uncertainty regarding details they had once described confidently. Still others refused to involve themselves any further. Whether those changes reflected genuine doubt or outside pressure remains one of the enduring mysteries surrounding the massacre. The possibility of intimidation has fascinated historians for generations. No definitive proof establishes widespread witness tampering. Yet the pattern proved impossible to ignore. The prosecution's case weakened as more testimony became inconsistent. The defense recognized that inconsistency immediately. Rather than proving complete innocence, defense lawyers focused on creating reasonable doubt. If witnesses disagreed with one another, if memories differed, if identifications changed, then certainty became impossible. The strategy did not require explaining exactly who committed the murders. It required convincing jurors that the prosecution could not establish guilt beyond doubt. For investigators, this development proved deeply frustrating. Months of work appeared to dissolve beneath uncertainty. The names remained the same. Community suspicion remained widespread. But suspicion alone has never been enough to secure lawful convictions. The investigation gradually transformed from a search for facts into a struggle over credibility. Whose memory should be believed? Whose motives should be trusted? Could long-standing hostility toward the Donnellys have encouraged false accusations? Or had fear prevented honest witnesses from speaking openly? Those questions hovered over every stage of the proceedings. Looking back today, historians often describe the investigation as a collision between two forms of justice. The first sought accountability through courts, evidence, and legal procedure. The second had already acted during the night of February 4th, convinced that judgment required no trial at all. The tragedy lay in the distance between those two systems. One produced irreversible deaths. The other struggled to produce legally sustainable proof. By the time prosecutors finalized their case, the investigation had identified suspects, gathered testimony, and reconstructed much of the night's events. Yet beneath that apparent progress remained an uncomfortable truth. Knowing what probably happened was not the same as proving it inside a courtroom. The authorities believed they were approaching the moment when years of rumor would finally meet the standards of law. Instead, they were about to discover that the greatest obstacle to justice was not finding suspects. It was persuading 12 jurors to believe that the evidence left no room for doubt. For weeks, the investigation had moved through uncertainty. The authorities believed they knew who had participated in the attack. The community believed it knew even more. Yet belief was never enough. Every murder investigation reaches a point where suspicion must become evidence, where whispered conversations must transform into testimony that can withstand legal scrutiny. In the Black Donnelly case, that moment seemed to arrive with the growing confidence of the prosecution. The breakthrough did not come in the form of a hidden weapon or a dramatic confession. It came from the gradual assembling of countless small pieces. Statements collected from residents. The recollections of surviving witnesses. The movements of suspected participants before and after the attack. Individually, each detail appeared fragile. Together, investigators hoped they formed a convincing picture of organized violence. As officials compared interviews, a pattern emerged. The same names surfaced repeatedly. Different witnesses recalled seeing certain men gathering before the massacre. Others remembered unusual activity during the late evening hours. Some spoke quietly about conversations overheard in the days before the killings, suggesting that anger toward the Donnellys had reached a dangerous intensity. No single statement solved the case. But each one appeared to strengthen the next. Investigators believed they were moving closer to demonstrating not merely who disliked the Donnellys, but who had acted upon that hatred. The child who had survived beneath the bed remained at the center of everything. Johnny O'Connor's testimony became the thread connecting scattered pieces of evidence into one narrative. He described familiar voices. He recalled faces illuminated by brief flashes of lantern light. He remembered enough details to convince investigators that his memories deserved careful consideration despite his youth. Modern psychology recognizes both the strengths and limitations of eyewitness memory, particularly after traumatic experiences. The investigators of 1880 possessed no such scientific framework. Instead, they relied upon observation. Was the boy consistent? Did his descriptions change? Could other evidence support his recollections? Again and again they returned to those questions. In many respects, Johnny's greatest strength as a witness was also his greatest vulnerability. He had survived. No one could dispute that. Yet because he was a child, every word he spoke invited scrutiny from those determined to challenge his credibility. The prosecution nevertheless believed that the truth remained on its side. As preparations for trial accelerated, officials organized evidence into a coherent sequence. The attack on the farmhouse. The deaths inside. The deliberate fire. The second assault resulting in John Donnelly's death. The coordinated movement of multiple individuals across the countryside. Rather than isolated acts of violence, investigators presented the massacre as a planned operation carried out by a group acting with common purpose. That theory explained why so many people appeared involved. It also explained why responsibility became difficult to assign to any one individual. Inside the community, reactions remained deeply divided. Some residents quietly expressed satisfaction that legal proceedings were finally approaching. Others feared the coming trials would expose long-buried conflicts extending far beyond one night's violence. Families found themselves choosing sides. Old friendships weakened. Conversations that once centered on farming, weather, and harvests increasingly revolved around witnesses, arrests, and rumors. The massacre had become impossible to separate from everyday life. Every trip to church. Every visit to the local store. Every chance meeting along a country road carried an unspoken awareness that anyone standing nearby might soon appear inside a courtroom. The emotional pressure upon witnesses continued to grow. Providing testimony in a close-knit rural settlement demanded extraordinary courage. Unlike anonymous cities, small communities remember. Accusations endure. Relationships survive for generations. Those called upon to testify understood that whatever they said under oath could permanently reshape their place within the township. Some remained committed to helping investigators. Others became increasingly uncertain. Whether that uncertainty reflected fading memory or growing fear proved impossible to measure. The prosecution worked carefully to reinforce its strongest evidence. Every interview was reviewed. Every timeline examined. Officials attempted to anticipate the questions defense attorneys would inevitably ask. How clearly could the witnesses see? How long had events lasted? Could darkness have distorted identification? Had conversations after the massacre influenced memory? Preparation became essential because the defense required only one outcome: reasonable doubt. The investigators needed certainty. The defense needed uncertainty. That distinction would define everything that followed. Outside official proceedings, newspapers fueled public fascination. Reports described developments in dramatic language, ensuring that interest spread far beyond Biddulph Township itself. Readers across Ontario followed the case with growing curiosity. Many viewed the massacre as an extraordinary crime demanding equally extraordinary justice. Others questioned whether prejudice against the Donnellys had complicated the search for truth from the very beginning. Public opinion became almost as divided as the township itself. For prosecutors, however, attention from outside communities created additional pressure. This was no longer merely a local investigation. The province expected answers. As the evidence was assembled, investigators became increasingly convinced that they had reached the strongest case possible under 19th-century conditions. They possessed eyewitness testimony. They possessed circumstantial evidence. They possessed a plausible reconstruction of events. Most importantly, they believed the attack had been sufficiently organized that jurors would recognize its collective nature. There remained no expectation of discovering a miraculous final piece of evidence. No hidden diary. No unexpected confession. The breakthrough was not dramatic because real investigations rarely are. Instead, it emerged from persistence. Hundreds of conversations. Countless comparisons. Repeated interviews. The patient effort to transform scattered memories into a legally persuasive narrative. By the time formal proceedings approached, investigators believed the essential mystery had been solved. They believed they understood how the attack unfolded. They believed they knew who participated. What remained uncertain was whether that understanding could survive confrontation inside a courtroom. The transition from investigation to trial represents one of the most difficult stages in any criminal case. Evidence collected privately becomes subject to public challenge. Witnesses encounter skilled cross-examination. Every inconsistency grows larger beneath legal scrutiny. Facts that appeared straightforward during interviews suddenly become complicated when opposing attorneys examine every word. The Black Donnelly investigation was about to experience that transformation. Prosecutors entered the coming trials believing they possessed enough evidence to secure convictions. Defense attorneys entered believing the prosecution had relied too heavily upon frightened witnesses, community rumor, and assumptions built over decades of hostility. Both sides understood what was at stake. For the families of the victims, the trials represented perhaps the only opportunity for accountability. For the accused, conviction meant the possibility of severe punishment for one of the most notorious crimes in Canadian history. For the community itself, the proceedings threatened to expose divisions that many had spent years attempting to hide. As court dates approached, anticipation spread throughout the region. People traveled considerable distances hoping to witness the legal confrontation. The courtroom promised something the investigation could never fully provide. A public examination of competing versions of the truth. Investigators reviewed their files one final time. Witnesses prepared themselves to testify. Defense teams refined strategies designed to challenge every important claim. The stage had been set. Months of investigative work would soon face its greatest test. The breakthrough that had seemed so promising now rested upon a fragile foundation. Because solving a crime and proving a crime are not the same thing. One depends upon understanding. The other depends upon evidence strong enough to persuade 12 independent minds beyond reasonable doubt. The investigation had carried the case as far as it could. From this point forward, justice belonged to the courtroom. When the trials finally began, expectations were immense. The murders of the Donnelly family had shocked communities far beyond Biddulph Township. Newspapers had followed the investigation with growing fascination, and public opinion had already begun forming long before the first witness entered the courtroom. Some people believed the prosecution had uncovered those responsible for one of the most notorious crimes in Canadian history. Others questioned whether the investigation itself had been shaped by years of rumor and resentment. Now the courtroom would become the place where those competing beliefs faced one another. The proceedings took place in London, Ontario, far removed from the burned farmhouse whose ruins still lingered in the memories of everyone connected to the case. Yet although the location had changed, the emotional weight of the massacre entered the courtroom with every witness, every lawyer, and every member of the jury. The prosecution faced a difficult challenge from the very beginning. Everyone agreed that a terrible crime had occurred. 5 members of the Donnelly family had lost their lives. Their home had been destroyed. A coordinated attack had taken place. Those facts were not seriously disputed. The true battle centered upon identity. Who had actually committed the murders? Could the prosecution prove beyond reasonable doubt that the accused men standing before the court had participated? Legal justice demands more than suspicion. It demands evidence. That principle became the foundation of the defense. Prosecutors presented the events of February 4th as a carefully organized assault carried out by multiple individuals acting together. They described the attack upon the farmhouse, the killings inside, the deliberate fire, and the second assault that claimed John Donnelly's life. Piece by piece, they attempted to reconstruct the darkest hours of that winter morning. The jury listened. Every detail carried enormous significance. The prosecution understood that no physical evidence alone could resolve the case. The fire had destroyed much of the crime scene. Modern forensic science did not yet exist. The case depended largely upon eyewitness testimony and the consistency of witness accounts. That reality placed extraordinary importance upon one young survivor. Johnny O'Connor entered the courtroom carrying a burden few adults could have endured. He was still only a child. Yet he had become the central witness in one of the most important criminal trials of his era. Every eye followed him. Every word mattered. Johnny described the attack as he remembered it. He spoke of armed men entering the farmhouse. He recalled hiding beneath a bed while violence unfolded around him. He explained that he recognized several participants. For the prosecution, his testimony represented the closest thing to direct evidence available. For the defense, it represented an opportunity. Cross-examination began. Defense attorneys questioned every aspect of Johnny's recollection. How dark had the room been? How long had he actually seen the attackers? Could fear have influenced his memory? Had anyone spoken to him afterward in ways that might have shaped his identification? The questions came one after another. None accused the child of deliberate dishonesty. Instead, they focused upon uncertainty. Because uncertainty creates doubt. And doubt favors the defense. Johnny answered as best he could. Yet no witness, particularly one recalling traumatic events, can eliminate every inconsistency. Small differences emerged. Minor details varied. Each variation became another point for defense counsel to emphasize before the jury. Other witnesses followed. Some supported portions of the prosecution's case. Others proved less certain than investigators had hoped. Memories differed. Descriptions failed to align perfectly. Statements made during the investigation occasionally appeared less confident when repeated under oath. Some witnesses who had once spoken openly now seemed hesitant. Others acknowledged hearing rumors rather than observing events firsthand. The prosecution watched its carefully assembled narrative become increasingly difficult to maintain. The defense recognized the opportunity immediately. Rather than proving an alternative version of events, defense lawyers concentrated on exposing weaknesses. They reminded jurors that criminal convictions required certainty, not possibility. They argued that community hostility toward certain individuals had encouraged assumptions. They suggested that long-standing conflict surrounding the Donnelly family had created an atmosphere where accusation became easier than proof. Every inconsistency mattered. Every hesitation mattered. Every uncertain memory mattered. The courtroom gradually became less about what had happened on the night of February 4th and more about whether anyone could establish those events with sufficient legal certainty. The distinction was profound. History often accepts probability. Courts require proof. Jurors carried an immense responsibility. They understood the horror of the massacre. They recognized the suffering endured by the victims. Yet sympathy alone could never replace evidence. Their duty required discipline. If reasonable doubt remained, the law demanded acquittal regardless of public opinion. Outside the courthouse, conversations continued. Newspapers reported each development. Citizens debated the testimony. Some remained convinced the prosecution had identified the correct men. Others believed the evidence had never reached the standard required for conviction. The trial became not only a legal proceeding but also a public reflection of the community's deep divisions. Eventually, the jury retired to deliberate. Inside the deliberation room, emotion could not replace legal instruction. Jurors reviewed testimony. They considered witness credibility. They examined inconsistencies. They measured certainty against doubt. When they returned, the decision stunned many observers. The prosecution had failed to secure a conviction. The jury did not find sufficient evidence to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. For the families of the victims, the verdict represented another devastating loss. The massacre remained real. The deaths remained undeniable. Yet the law had identified no one legally responsible. The legal process, however, was not entirely finished. A second trial followed involving another accused participant. Once again prosecutors attempted to strengthen their case. Once again witnesses appeared. Once again testimony faced intense cross-examination. The essential difficulties remained unchanged. Memories conflicted. Physical evidence remained limited. Questions persisted regarding identification and reliability. When the second proceedings concluded, the outcome echoed the first. Another failure to secure conviction. The legal system had reached its limit. No further courtroom victory followed. No definitive judgment established the guilt of those long suspected. Officially, the massacre remained without a convicted killer. The coroner's findings reflected that painful reality. The victims had unquestionably been murdered. But those responsible remained, in legal terms, unidentified. It was an extraordinary conclusion for such an extraordinary crime. 5 members of one family had died. A farmhouse had been burned to the ground. A surviving eyewitness had testified. Multiple arrests had been made. Yet justice, as measured by convictions, never arrived. Historians continue to debate why. Some emphasize weaknesses within 19th-century investigative methods. Others point toward the limitations of forensic science. Many believe witness intimidation or community pressure discouraged truthful testimony. Still others argue that the prosecution simply lacked evidence capable of satisfying legal standards. Perhaps each explanation contains part of the truth. Whatever the reason, the consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. The verdicts influenced public memory for generations. Supporters of the accused viewed the acquittals as confirmation that the wrong men had been charged. Supporters of the Donnelly family interpreted the outcome very differently. To them, the trials demonstrated how fear, loyalty, and silence could prevent accountability even after a crime witnessed by an entire community. The courtroom doors eventually closed. Judges moved on to other cases. Lawyers returned to their practices. Jurors resumed ordinary lives. But the questions remained. Who planned the attack? Who entered the farmhouse first? Who fired the fatal shots? Who ignited the flames? Those answers never received the certainty that history so often demands. The law had spoken. History continued asking questions. And somewhere between those two realities, the Black Donnelly massacre became something larger than a criminal case. It became one of Canada's most enduring examples of the painful distance that can exist between truth and proof. Sometimes investigators believe they know what happened. Sometimes communities believe they know who is responsible. Yet inside a courtroom, belief carries little weight unless supported by evidence strong enough to overcome every reasonable doubt. For the Donnelly family, that burden proved impossible to meet. Their killers, whoever they were, walked away from the courtroom as free men. The victims never walked away at all. When the courtroom fell silent and the final verdicts were delivered, the case of the Black Donnellys did not end. It simply changed shape. The legal system had spoken, but the silence it left behind was far louder than any judgment. In Biddulph Township, life continued in a way that felt almost unnatural. The same roads were still traveled. The same fields were still plowed. Church bells still rang on Sundays, calling people to gather beneath stained glass windows that had witnessed both celebration and mourning across generations. Yet nothing felt unchanged. Every familiar place now carried invisible weight. The burned remains of the farmhouse stood as a constant reminder of what had occurred. Even when the ruins were cleared or slowly reclaimed by time, the memory of that night never left the land. People who passed the site often did so more quickly than necessary, as if distance alone could ease discomfort. The Donnelly name itself became something heavier than a family identity. It became a warning. For some, it represented violence and disorder, a reminder of what could happen when law and order broke down in isolated communities. For others, it represented something far more unsettling, the possibility that justice could fail even when the truth felt obvious. Over time, stories replaced records. Children grew up hearing fragments rather than facts. Some heard tales of a dangerous family who had brought destruction upon themselves. Others heard stories of a community that had turned against its own members, allowing suspicion to become execution. Neither version ever fully captured the complexity of what had happened. Because the truth of the Black Donnelly massacre did not fit neatly into a single narrative. It existed somewhere in the space between accusation and proof, between memory and silence, between law and vengeance. The survivors of that night carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. Johnny O'Connor, the child who hid beneath a bed while violence unfolded above him, could never return to the world he had known before. Even as years passed, the memory of footsteps, voices, and burning would remain part of his personal history. For him, the massacre was not a story told in books. It was a moment lived in darkness, one that no courtroom verdict could erase or resolve. The families connected to the accused also lived under the shadow of the trials. Acquittal did not restore peace. Suspicion lingered in quiet conversations, in avoided eye contact, in relationships that never fully recovered from the strain of accusation. In small rural communities, memory has a long life. It passes through generations not as formal record but as inherited feeling. The Black Donnelly massacre became exactly that kind of memory. Over time, historians attempted to reconstruct the events with greater distance and perspective. They examined court transcripts, witness accounts, and newspaper reports. They compared versions of events and tried to separate rumor from evidence. Yet even with modern analysis, certainty remained elusive. Some aspects of the case seemed clear. A family had been attacked in their home. Several individuals had participated. The attack had been deliberate and coordinated. But the identities of every participant, the exact sequence of decisions, and the full motivation behind the violence remained partially obscured by time and contradiction. That ambiguity is part of why the story continues to endure. It is not only a crime story. It is a question that refuses to settle. What happens when an entire community believes it knows the truth, but the legal system cannot prove it? What happens when justice is demanded by emotion, but requires evidence instead? What happens when silence protects individuals more effectively than law can reach them? The Black Donnelly massacre sits at the center of those questions. Not because it is the most violent crime in Canadian history, but because it exposes the fragile boundary between law and belief. Over the decades, the story has been retold in books, documentaries, and oral tradition. Each retelling emphasizes different elements. Some focus on the alleged criminal history of the Donnelly family. Others focus on the possibility of wrongful accusations and community-driven violence. Few can avoid the tension between those interpretations. Because certainty is something the case never fully allows. The farmhouse is gone now, but the landscape still carries its memory. Fields continue to grow where tragedy once unfolded. Seasons change without acknowledgement of what occurred there more than a century ago. Yet for those who know the story, the the land is never entirely ordinary. It is a place where rumor became action, where neighbors became executioners, where the law arrived too late to prevent violence and too weak to assign final accountability. The absence of conviction did not erase the event. It only deepened its mystery. And that mystery is what continues to draw attention long after the last trial ended. There is a temptation, when looking back at cases like this, to search for a single explanation, to decide definitively who was right and who was wrong, to assign clear roles of victim and perpetrator without ambiguity. But the Black Donnelly massacre resists that simplicity. It reflects a reality that is more uncomfortable and more human. Communities are capable of both protection and destruction. Rumor can grow into certainty without ever becoming truth. Fear can unify groups just as easily as justice can divide them. And when law fails to intervene early enough, people sometimes begin to believe they must take justice into their own hands. The cost of that belief is written across every detail of this case. Not only in the deaths that occurred in the burning farmhouse, but in the decades of unanswered questions that followed. In the families who never received closure. In the witnesses who carried memories they could never fully explain. In the accused who were never legally convicted but never fully freed from suspicion. The Black Donnelly massacre remains, in the end, less a story about a single night and more a reflection of how fragile truth becomes when placed under the pressure of fear, resentment, and time. Justice, in its purest form, is meant to arrive after careful examination, guided by evidence rather than emotion. But in Biddulph Township on that winter night in 1880, justice arrived in a very different form. It arrived in the darkness. It arrived without a trial. And once it left, it never returned in a way that could satisfy anyone fully. What remains today is not resolution. It is memory. And the uneasy understanding that some crimes do not end when the violence stops. They end when people stop agreeing on what the truth even was.